Welcome everybody to episode 4 of Green Talks. I'm Ryan Thogmartin. This is Darren Crouch with Passages International. Darren, we got a great topic to discuss today, one that's insanely relevant for the time that we're in. We've been kind of flipped upside down in this profession over the last 10 weeks with a global pandemic, and that has changed the way that we gather. It's changed the experience that families have. It's really stripped out a lot of the traditional funeral experience, where funeral homes are having to make a lot of different changes to meet with families virtually, have funerals virtually. And that leads to the experience that families expect when dealing with a funeral home. And you've got some very interesting thoughts on the experience that families expect, and then the experience that they're actually getting when they're using a funeral home or crematory.
Right. I feel like, the last 10 weeks of, obviously been a bit of an anomaly, but I think, the industry's been going this way for a long time. And if we look at the wedding industry, for example, weddings left churches a long time ago. And now if you're going to a wedding, you don't necessarily ask, okay, which church is it at? It's like, it could be at the beach, It could be at the mountaintop, it could be at the country club, it could be anywhere. And I think funerals are headed that way, or are well underway in that direction, in terms of, where are we going to remember someone? Is it going to be at the cemetery? Is it going to be in the church? More and more, that's not the case. And so, what we're working with funeral homes on is helping them to educate families on some of the unique experiences they can have that will allow them to say goodbye and honor the deceased in a completely unique way that is meaningful to that family.
And that's it. Every family's different, and it's not a standard operating procedure with every family that walks through the door. At least it should not be that. So it's interesting, educating funeral homes on the experiences that families can have. You're a product company, right? Like you're creating green products. How does that play into experience?
Well, you're right. I mean, we are a product company and we want to sell products, but at the end of the day, the product is a means to an end. The product allows the consumer to have the experience they want, whether it's, scattering off the end of a cruise ship, or on the beach where people spent summers, or, planting a tree in the woods where they used to hunt. The experience has changed. And I think in many ways, these new experiences are much more memorable for the families and friends. And in many cases, what it allows the family to do is participate versus be a spectator. If you think about, traditional funerals at a church, at a funeral home, at a cemetery, you are a spectator, and you're lucky if you can even throw dirt on the casket before they close the grave. And I think there's this desire for consumers to really participate in the event. And I think there are two reasons for that. Number one is it's honoring and saying goodbye to the deceased. And number two, it's healing. I think we talk about, grief and coming to terms with the deceased. And I think traditional American funerals, in some regards, have robbed the grieving with that sort of coping mechanism, because the industry has taken all of the problems away from the consumer, which has been for good. I mean, they haven't done it with any malice. It's all been trying to help. But I think what that's done is it made the funeral process very clinical. And somebody dies, the deceased is whisked away. 3 days later, they're out for viewing. 2 hours later, they're dead and they're buried and gone. And you're like, whoa, what happened? Whereas in the old days, I mean, you're literally preparing the body at your home. You're washing the body. I've seen and heard about memorial services where people, have actually put their hand into the plastic bag of cremated remains and lifted ashes out and just let it run through their hands and stuff. And, I think 10 years ago that would be like, ooh, we need to do that. We don't have to see the cremated remains, let alone have to touch them and put their hands in them.
Right.
But there is this desire, I think, for families to be like, hey, I love this person. I'm going to hold on to them one more time, and I'm going to let them go through my fingers. And I think there's a power to that, and there's a healing to that. you know, and part of the business that funeral directors are in is guiding families through this very traumatic time of their life. You know, it's not about making the problem go away. It's about
That's right.
helping the family cope with what's happened and
Yeah.
say goodbye in a meaningful way. And I think in some regards, the industry lost sight of that, and it became about the dead body. Let's make sure the
Yeah.
makeup is good. Let's make sure the features are set. Let's make sure they have shoes on. And the consumers are like, I don't care. The person's not there anymore. That's a
Yeah.
shell. Yes, we want the funeral home to treat the deceased with dignity and care. But at the same time, if I don't bring the shoes in time for the cremation, who cares? That's way down the list of the consumer's priority. But for the funeral director, that's like, oh, we can't cremate without the shoes. You know, so it kind of goes back to that same theme that we've had through a lot of these conversations, which is alignment with the consumer. And if we're trying to force someone, or if we're talking about how important it is for someone to have shoes and the consumer doesn't care that their dad doesn't have shoes, it just becomes an irritant, not a helping us cope with this loss.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's more of, I've got a checklist and I got to get through this checklist, regardless of what you want. This checklist,
Right.
I got to get something in this box. And
Right.
so, and that doesn't provide the best experience. And, you know, one of the things I love about our conversations is you guys do a lot of research. Like you study the profession, you're studying consumer trends, you're studying what consumers want. How is this conversation playing on, you know, educating consumers about experience, or funeral homes about experiences? You know, what's that look like from your research standpoint with consumers?
You know, we're getting a lot of good feedback from consumers. I mean, we're doing a lot of stuff on social media, more and more recently on social media, and you know, some of the data from the NFDA Consumer Preference Survey also bears this out. But I think as I just talk to people in the community, you know, myself, and I tell people what I do, and I hear their stories, you know, what I'm hearing from the consumer and what I see day to day as I talk to funeral directors, they just don't align very well.
Yeah.
And to me, when I think about what I would want, you know, in the last episode, we talked about the cardboard box. I mean, how many funeral directors would want to put their loved one in a cardboard box? Yet we put 80% of the families that are our customers, our bread and butter, we're putting their loved one in a cardboard box. You know, and it's like there's this disconnect. So
huge disconnect.
Listening.
That's the most important word I think that we've said this whole time is listening. And we don't tend to listen to the consumer's wants and needs because we feel like we know better. Like this is our job, right? And it's so funny what you can learn just having a conversation with the consumer. You know, I talked to a company that does research, and you know, we were looking from a content standpoint. You know, we'll run a lot of paid Facebook content where we're targeting consumers just to get a response from the consumer prior to ever, you know, presenting that type of content to a client. We've already done consumer research to know whether or not that's something that the consumer will engage with, and we use Facebook dark posts to do that. But it's essentially like, you know, I remember as a kid walking through the mall and my parents getting stopped by somebody with a clipboard that, you know, that you would get a 20% off coupon for that store if they could ask you 5 questions before you went in. And, you know, the days of people walking down the street asking questions, that still happens. And so we were talking with a company about research, and I said, so how are you going to present this video to this family? I said, we're going to just walk down the street of a big city and we're going to stop people and have them watch a 30-second video. I'm like, you get the most raw, honest feedback by just having conversations. And, you know, I think that we tend to lean on how families react once they're in the crematory or the funeral home versus, you know, that we've kind of put them in a container of sorts once they step into that environment where their wants and needs aren't addressed perfectly, where prior to coming in, they may have a completely different opinion of what they want. but it gets conformed when they walk into the building because, well, these are the options and I can't deviate from those. So, I think that, this is a conversation that goes much deeper than what you and I are going to take it in 10 minutes, but, understanding the consumer and not relying on feedback that we get just inside the building, but feedback that we get outside once the family's processed it or prior to them ever needing the crematory or the funeral home. What do they want in that scenario, and how do we provide that?
Right. And I've kind of seen this bear out in my own family. My brother-in-law lives in LA, and his mom passed away in a nursing home, and he called a funeral home. And even though I'm in this business, and his parents-in-law and brothers and sisters-in-law are also in the funeral side of the business, he was calling funeral homes because he didn't know what to do. He's like, my mom just died. What do I do? And I think one of the funeral homes that he called immediately got to price, because you and I both know the big buzzword, or has been over the last few years, is price shoppers, right? Mm-hmm. So funeral directors are so conscious about people calling to get the price, feeling like they're calling 5 other funeral homes to get a comparison of pricing. My brother-in-law was literally calling to be like, hey, help. My mom just died. Can you help me out? And price was like way down the list of his considerations. But the first thing the person answering the phone said was, if you need our GPL, it's on the website. He was almost offended. He's like, I just need some help. You know what I mean? It's weird how, how industry norms or perceptions within the industry completely can completely be misconstrued when it comes to the front lines of what we're actually doing. And I can see from a business owner's perspective where you're training your staff or your funeral directors to check the boxes, as you said, because that's, you want to make sure all these things get handled. But at the same time, the family may want something completely different. And if the funeral director doesn't have the leeway to pivot to make, that family happy, then you're losing an opportunity to get a great review on social media, or to upsell additional products, or be involved in the process down the road,
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we look at NFDA's consumer survey, it says that 90.4% of consumers shop 0 to 1 funeral home. So less than 10% of the market are actually price shopping, yet we focus so much on it. And, the top 2 reasons that a family chose a funeral home, according to that survey, which, I think is pretty accurate, was proximity and then the relationship they had with the funeral home. Like, price was 4th or 5th on the list of what the family actually wanted by contacting the funeral home. And, I think we get, like you said, we get very clouded, we get blinders on, and okay, so we have to get to this, this, and this. And it's almost like this automation process where regardless of what the family says, we're just going down through the checklist, and that doesn't create a positive experience at all. So, I mean, I don't think you and I are going to solve this in a conversation, but this, it's important to know that there's companies like yours and that are doing the research on the consumer. You're creating products and processes for funeral homes to use that help address that experience that the consumer is wanting. And at the end of the day, when the consumer leaves that facility, the experience is all that they have to talk about. And the funeral home or crematory is in control of that conversation based on the experience that they provided.
That's exactly right. And so what we're trying to do as a company is take that knowledge and provide a solution for funeral directors in both the terms of a digital kind of booklet, experience booklet, and a printed booklet that the funeral director can give to the family or email to the family, that they can kind of flip through and say, wow, I didn't know I could do that. And really, some of it's going to be pretty out there in terms of, some of the ideas we're going to give people. We know that people are going to come back sort of more to the middle, but we want people to have an idea of some of the unique things they can do to honor a loved one, which I think provides value and creates value in terms of the funeral director. This came from the funeral director. They're helping me honor my loved one. And so we're looking at those things very closely to help funeral directors really communicate that, hey, we're paying attention. If you want a church service and a traditional funeral, we got that. If you want something completely outside the norm, which of course now is the norm, we also have that.
Exactly right. I think that's a great stopping point. Darren, I appreciate these conversations and tackling, these are things that need to be tackled. These are hurdles, and at the end of the day, that consumer experience is the perception. Regardless of what we want to say, funeral services, the consumer is in control, and they're the ones writing the narrative. And unless we aid them in the things that they want, the narrative isn't going to reflect well. So, I appreciate the work that you're doing, and the consumer research that your company's doing, and developing solutions that make that experience positive for families.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.